Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Tanya Fotis. I am a research fellow at the National Ageing Research Institute, and welcome to our online Seminars in Ageing program. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us are meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. A little housekeeping regarding Zoom. At the end of the talk today, we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them through the seminar using the chat function, and which can be opened using the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Today, we have a special guest. We'll be hearing from Dr. Greg Kennedy from Swinburne University. Dr. Greg Kennedy is a postdoctoral research fellow in the area of neurocognitive aging at Swinburne University's Centre for Human Psychopharmacology. His research is predominantly in the area of cardiovascular functionality, health and exercise, and the influence these have on cognitive aging. He also collaborates with other research groups investigating the cognitive effects of hearing, augmentation and polyphenols. He implemented and ran the LILAC exercise and diet clinical trial, which produced pilot data for the successful 1.8 million NHMRC Dementia Prevention grant to conduct the MedWalk trial. Greg now manages this very large clinical trial, which is investigating the potential for Mediterranean diet and increased exercise to reduce cognitive decline and dementia risk in older Australians. And today he'll be presenting Modifying the Effects of Exercise and Diet on the Aging Brain. Welcome, Greg, and over to you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. I'll get the PowerPoint up and started, and I'll go from there. Okay, can you see my screen there properly? Fantastic. All right, thank you everybody for coming along, and thank you for Nairi for inviting me to speak to you all. Today I was going to talk about pretty much some research that we've done in exercise and diet, predominantly in terms of modifying or reducing cognitive decline in older people. As Tanya said, I work for Swinburne University in the Centre of Human Psychopharmacology, and there we go. And a lot of what we do is really based, I find this diagram quite useful, been using it for a long time, in this what we call age-associated cognitive decline. So really, again, I'm probably preaching to the choir for some people, but the trajectory of our cognition, our thinking, our memory, attention, is it improves rapidly to early adulthood, and unfortunately for all of us, we have a drop off in most of it over the lifespan, and particularly towards the later adulthood, and particularly in disease pathologies and processes, that tends to that can drop quite rapidly. So a lot of what we do really is to try and reduce the curve, so to speak, reduce the slope. So the more preservation, longer we can preserve things. And it also seems to be, after you get to a certain point, that's when we enter a larger risk for diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. Now, some of these areas of cognition tend to not really decline for most of us across our lives. It's quite nice to know that something's not going downhill for us. Things like general knowledge, vocabulary, verbal ability. The verbal ability doesn't mean we can still find the words we're looking for, but the words are still there. However, most other things that involve more immediate memory, reaction times, processing, attention, all tend to drop throughout the lifespan. So what we ran, myself and my colleague Roy Hardman, we ran the LILAC trial, the Lifestyle Intervention in Aging in Aged Care trial. And this trial was really aimed at trying to take the evidence that was around in terms of exercise and diet, particularly in terms of interventions that we could do to help preserve cognition in older people. Both Roy and myself were PhD students at the time, and this was a largely unfunded study, although it was supported by some companies. Again, I will rush through this pretty quickly because I think a lot of us here who do things, work through NARI, do understand the importance of what we're doing. Obviously, we have a rapidly aging population, and that aging, as I said, is accompanied by that progressive, inevitable decline in cognitive ability, and that, of course, is exacerbated in age-related diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Well, why is it important? The thing that we tend to forget or not think about, not talk about, particularly in policy level, is really as loss of cognition, especially going into disease pathologies, can mean a loss of independence and a significant reduction in that quality of life. It's also in the area that I work with, we work a lot with retirement villages into aged care, is there's a big challenge for the aged care system. As we lose our independence, people tend to progress through levels of care or require levels of care, and that ends up obviously with increased costs, both financial and human costs, of course. So one of the goals is really what can we do to maintain our ability to live independently for as long as possible. Hence why we work quite a lot in the research I do with the what I would call the retirement community or the independent living retirement communities, to work with the people there to what can be done, what can we do to help preserve people's cognition, keep them independent for as long as possible. So you're really dealing with both the physical and the mental impacts that would lead to loss of independence. So to precursor what we did for this study, my colleague and I wrote a couple of reviews on these major areas. Colleague Dr. Roy Hardman looked at the evidence that was garnered from the longitudinal studies and prospective trials of Mediterranean diet. There's lots of cross-sectional stuff, there's lots of other information out there, but looking at what the higher level evidence, I guess, shows us for the Mediterranean diet in particular. This tends to be chosen for a lot of our research because people in these Mediterranean areas, particularly more rural Mediterranean areas where there is low meat consumption and high vegetable consumption, tend to very often show much lower rates of dementia, much more preservation of cognition, and also physical fitness and health. I put this up just to show, I think what's more important than the reviews themselves, although they're important, is really the interest in the scientific community that they are garnering. So I just checked this out the other day. This particular review by Roy is literally in the top 1% of all nutrition papers that have been viewed or downloaded by the scientific community and the public, with a better part of 80,000 people having already looked through it over the last 5 years or so. Myself, I looked at exercise and age-associated cognitive decline. And what was interesting was the problem with this area was too much information. It was too much and too difficult. So it was an enormous challenge to find a way to contain that into something that was absorbable. I think at one stage I was looking at 62,000 articles that were somewhat related to this idea. Impossible to get your head around. Hence why I tried to condense that information into this sort of idea of what exercise does for the brain, particularly in those of us who are older, and why that might be possibly working. I think that's the next question, the big question. Plenty of theories out there, but this one covered the main sort of half a dozen theories or so. Again, more than that, as an idea of how interesting or interested the community is, and really how we are desperately searching around for, well, the medical model's not working. The the find a cure, find a pill model is not working for cognitive decline and particularly dementia risk. So again, this was this article was popular enough with the editors and the reviewers and the general public to win the 2018 Alzheimer's Award, showing you that again for the first time it was a paper on prevention, not so much mechanism. It was really about what can we do when the pharmaceutical direction is not serving us well at all. So from that, we developed the Lilac trial itself. As I said, this was a 6-month intervention trial. Looked at people aged 60 to 90. And that's an interesting start because almost every paper you read will define the older generation, or do the research in 65 to 85. I'm not sure particularly why. Because one of the first things that we kicked back at is the range of people that were living retired or in retirement communities that were still quite healthy and able was a lot broader than that. And we pushed to expand that range to a more representative population. Again, we choose the independent living aged care communities because there is people that are still generally, at least mostly physiologically and cognitively well. But there is a demonstrably, not surprisingly, just due to the age group, a higher risk of transition to Alzheimer's pathology and also reduction in dependence and movement to different levels of care. The other part of this study that was different from many was the fact that we included a range of medications. And we did that for a reason, but mainly because in this age group, almost everybody's on medication. So if you're not looking at people on medications, as many studies don't, then I'm not really sure who you're doing the study for. The design was a 4-group design with a monitoring and control group, a walking group, a Mediterranean diet only group, and a combination of the two, Mediterranean diet and walking intervention study. What we looked at in this study, the measures we used were dietary assessments, which we used the Comprehensive Cancer Council Food Frequency Questionnaire. A very, very good food frequency process, well assessed, and I do advise it to people who might be looking at dietary research. Next to doing food diaries, individual food diaries, one of the best I've come across. So the 6-minute walk test, very simple test, turns out to be quite a powerful measure and indicator of physical health and fitness. It really literally is just walking backwards and forwards for 6 minutes between witches' hats, but was very reflective of a lot of things, including people's cognitive abilities, actually, as well as the CHAMPS, which was a self-assessed measure of exercise. Now, the important thing and where we come from, particularly at Swinburne, is cognitive assessment. Most of these assessments and a lot of these trials are done what we call pen and paper tests. It's quite common. That's where most of the psychological tests are. But what we've done is to develop our own set of what we call computerized cognitive assessments. And what this allows us to do is to look at a combination of a very fine-grained changes in reaction times and accuracy, particularly reaction times. We can see changes in the millisecond range over a year because the human brain changes slowly. So to work out efficacy is quite difficult in a moderately short term of 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. But this sort of testing makes those sort of assessments, those sort of trials actually feasible and possible, because the long-term ones are often just too expensive to conduct. We also looked at a number of secondary outcomes, which I won't go into too much, a lot of biomarkers. I will look at one in a few minutes that I will outline, which is what we call aortic stiffness, which turns out to be quite important. And that is the health of the major descending aorta from the heart down to the legs, so through the torso. These are the type of artery that is quite different from other arteries. and does seem to lead to potentially be related to cognitive decline, and there's also a lot of evidence that the stiffer this artery gets over time, the more pressure it puts on the brain, and therefore may well be related to dementia pathologies as one of the cardiovascular links to dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease. We also looked at other psychological assessments and medications. Oops. I do want to mention just very quickly the groups that supported us. We were too egotistical, naive, middle-aged men when we started this trial. And we were told there's no way you could do a clinical trial with no support. I like to sit here in front of people now and say that that's not true. However, if they told me I was a bloody idiot, that would be completely correct, because it was incredibly difficult to do it. But the support, not so much financial, although Cobram Estate donated some olive oil and Dorevitch pathology, collected blood for us for nothing, which was amazing. But also the support of a number of the retirement village communities, businesses, allowing us access, providing us rooms and facilities to do the research in. We couldn't have done it without them. So I always like to mention those. There's no financial impact here. It was just their in-kind support. So we took the study to the people. That's the other thing I find very difficult about many clinical trials, is that they are predominantly based in universities or hospitals. People come to you. And that really means that you have a certain type of people, the sort of people that want to come into universities, are prepared to travel, that can travel and want to spend the time. So part of what we wanted to do was to take our research out to, as far as we could, spreading it out through the suburbs and going to people. So the travel, the intimidation of a university environment, etc., wasn't the restricting factor. So we spread fairly well through Melbourne as best we could, trying to spread ourselves out around towards the outskirts as well, Kilsyth, Mornington, Geelong, etc., as well as more centralised areas. So as I said, we took the research out to the people. So we took them out to the villages. So this is a typical idea of our setups. We basically had to make do and change in each particular facility or retirement village to find a 10-metre walking space, to set up a consulting bed. I mean, but through this we could take with us, in nothing more than the boot of a car, a battery of psychological tests, physical tests, cardiovascular tests. So we did really manage to achieve something that was quite unique and hadn't been done before, which is to design a portable lab and take it out to villages, to actually get a better, more representative cohort of the people who we were trying to help and work with. The Mediterranean diet. So probably the biggest restriction in this study, which I'll talk about a little more afterwards, was there was just 2 of us doing about 106 people, if I remember correctly, over a year. Didn't give us very much time to do a lot of reinforcement with the interventions. We gave people a lot of instructions. We designed recipe books, gave them olive oil and other things that would help them with their dietary changes, ways to keep records. But I guess where things fell down, some of the changes didn't work as well as we liked, although they still made them. We still think that without the constant support, we all know that changing diets or increasing exercise is really very difficult without ongoing support. So the fact that people made changes, it all showed the motivation, but it showed me also where we had left to go in following trials. And very similarly to the diet, the exercise component really looked at a walking guide, a walking program, a way to increase your walking safely, a way to make sure that your walking was actually beneficial, and predominantly a few other things for motivation and record keeping. So findings, a lot of the findings, a lot of the major findings for this we have cross-sectional or baseline findings where we had the most people. Obviously, we had more people at the start than we did at the end due to the natural attrition in the clinical trial. Unfortunately, given the age group, we had a couple of people also either passed away or developed cognitive symptoms, early dementia symptoms, etc. So the first one was looking at the Mediterranean diet, just with our cohort, and its effect on cognition with medications. So again, well, we included medications and didn't want to exclude people. Medications turned out to be more important than we realised. So this is I won't spend too much time on it. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. And again, it's not my primary. My primary is the exercise. But what we did is we clustered people into different medical clusters based on their medications. So it might be intestinal conditions, bone conditions, cardio conditions, or relatively healthy. And these diagrams basically show the proportion, and also what we did is we clustered people by statistically between faster reaction times, which tends to indicate better, more intact cognition, and slower reaction times. So people tended to fall into one of two groups fairly well. And interestingly, so the blue is the faster reaction time in each group, and the grey is the slower reaction time. We anticipated that the relatively healthy, which was the people who took primarily preventative medications, not very many, we anticipated that they would have the most intact cognition, and that turned out surprisingly not to be the case. Interestingly, it was the people on blood pressure medications, blood thinners, cholesterol medications, or usually a combination, that actually turned out to be better cognitively. And that does line up with the thinking of the last couple of international Alzheimer's conferences, etc., where more and more there's been a push for more aggressive controlling of blood pressure, particularly to keep that down, to keep the pressure on the brain, and especially the small vessels of the brain. So it's still in the early days, but it wasn't what we were looking for directly, but it was interesting that that's what we found in this study as well. And again, initially, looking at the group as a whole, diet didn't seem to have much effect on people's cognitive performance. But once we took medications into account, we had found a couple of interesting findings. It did seem that the greater energy intake increased your odds of having slower or poorer cognition. Surprisingly, about every additional kilojoule or so increased the chances of being the slower time about 53%, basically saying it was a relatively strong effect, stronger than we anticipated. I will point out too that we didn't have really many people you would define as being frail, where this would almost certainly be reduced, where people start to actually significantly reduce their energy intake. So bearing in mind the population was relatively physically healthy. So that needs to be taken in context with the sort of people you're talking about. But more importantly, for our point of view, it was interesting to see that better Mediterranean diet scores decrease the odds of having that slower cognition. So basically, if the diet score was out of 14, every additional point from that score, your chance of being in that slower group declined by about 43%. So again, quite a reasonably strong effect in the scheme of things. Going on to the fitness findings, particularly in terms of aortic stiffness and cognition. So this is, I guess, for me, this is my primary area where I find the most interest. So I looked at cognition, and we basically divide it into 4 different categories: reaction times, short-term memory, also spatial working memory, cognitive processing, so how fast we process something, and literally our visual memory. 4 main categories that particularly these 3, and even more so particularly this one, we know short-term memory or spatial working memory declines the fastest with aging. And it's time and time again, we find that is one that declines the most with aging. So we do look carefully at that one to see whether we see anything, because that's more likely, given the rate of change, we're more likely to see results. However, we looked at everything together against fitness as measured just by the simple 6-minute walk. So for anybody doing future research, this turns out to be quite a powerful measure. And also the aortic stiffness I talked about, the health of that major descending aorta in the body. And what we found from this initial analysis was that fitness did indeed influence how good somebody's short-term memory was relative to their age, particularly, and relatively strongly. That beta weight actually indicates a relatively strong contribution, so to speak, or at least association. We looked at all the cardiovascular measures, all the normal sort of things we do, like blood pressure and many other ones, but it was only aortic stiffness that was related to short-term memory as well. So basically, the more people could walk in 6 minutes, the better their short-term memory was, regardless of relative to their age, and the better or healthier or more elastic their artery was, the better their short-term memory. So the question then came, well, is there a relationship between the two? Unlike other arteries, this one is not as well or easily, as far as we know, very difficult to influence. It seems to be a degradation over time issue. So we designed I investigated in a model which I use quite often now for my students, looking at the major things that influence cognition and how they might relate. So body mass index, basically their size, people's age. So age is the strongest predictor of short-term memory, or in fact any of the cognitive outcomes. And sex, there is a difference between performance on different tests between the genders, between the sexes. For some women do better than men, and vice versa. For some men do better than women. So interestingly for us, the fact that fitness, the effective age was explained by fitness and aortic stiffness. So that seems to be that there was no direct relationship between age. It was all mediated by fitness and aortic stiffness, which is a very exciting find. Not necessarily completely surprising, but the question's always been, well, what is the thing? Why is it? Why do people get worse at these things when they get older? And it seems to be mediated by these. Particularly, that's not surprising that aortic stiffness or the health of the aorta is age-related, because it's effectively like a three-dimensional rubber band, and if you keep stretching it over millions and millions of times, it tends to the elastin gets cracked and stiffens up over time. And fitness, again, it's not surprising that people do, in general, get less fit as they get older. Not always. But the really exciting part was that this explained 33% of the variation in this model. Explained 33% of the variation in short-term memory. We're used to dealing in 2, 3, 4% areas. So we were quite excited by the strength of that finding. I've basically gone through that, but really what it shows me, we're not so sure exactly what we can do about the aortic health, but really it does underlie the importance of maintaining fitness for as long as possible and as best as possible. Because it seems to be the one very obvious thing from our cross-sectional findings that we can do, which is to, particularly for memory, is to improve if we can, maintain where we can. But basically, I was asked by a participant a while ago, what's the minimum amount of exercise I should do? And I said, well, if you never leave the bed, then getting to the lounge room is an improvement. If you're doing that, getting to the post box is an improvement. Every additional step is going to make a difference. It's all great to have 10,000 step ideas or 6,000 or whatever it might be, but improving on what you're doing is probably the best message there. So coming to the actual longitudinal findings of the study, what we really didn't find much. Again, there wasn't a huge amount of change in every group, which makes it all the more interesting that we did find something with the combined Mediterranean diet and walking group. And bear in mind, these were self-motivated people. They really weren't getting assistance or that much help to change. And we'll probably come to that, but that's one of the biggest probably lessons for us in the future. Just to show you very quickly that the groups were really very similar. There wasn't a lot of difference between them, so we weren't seeing anything just due to the numbers or types or age or body size of the participants. So what we found with the study was that basically people in the combined exercise and diet group had a change around about 100, 120 milliseconds, which is a pretty decent change on average people. This is a pretty decent change in just 6 months. In fact, it's quite extraordinary to even pick up the change in that time. And their performance score, which it's a little bit hard to explain the units, but it's looking at not just how fast you do something, but how accurate, because often we sacrifice speed for accuracy. It's just something we all do as we get older. So to control for that, we found that the effect was even stronger when we controlled for that effect. So basically, again, it was in the spatial working memory task, one we know is the most sensitive to a lot of things. Yes, those groups did show improvement across just 6 months of what was not very, not huge changes in diet and exercise, but definitely changes. We also particularly noticed a significantly lower score in the depression and anxiety stress scale, across depression, anxiety and stress. So not just brain performance, but also psychological health. Effectively, as a quick measure of psychological health, people were less depressed, scored less on depression, anxiety and stress scores. So very exciting from a study that wasn't really expected to be able to get off the ground, to find something that was that interesting and useful. This was parlayed by us, particularly by our supervisor and international team from around Australia, as well as the UK and Ireland, to an NHMRC Boosting Dementia grant. Only 13 of these grants were given. And we started the trial called the MedWalk trial, which secured a reasonable amount of funding. That's just very exciting for all of us, all the teams that got some of that research, because prevention research is still vastly underfunded. This proportionally is a drop in the ocean compared to pharmaceutical research, etc., and particularly in these longer term health outcomes when governments and people can't see immediate benefits. So again, I can go through the rationale. I think we all know, a lot of us here, that there's just a financial rationale for reducing dementia, with a projected cost of over $1 trillion in the next 40 years. I think this is what I keep highlighting, is that there's no long-term viable pharmaceutical options. Even the latest active number, I can never say the last drug, is really for a very specific window, and still there's arguments over the statistics used to even show that works. So all the billions of dollars that have been spent over the years, we've got literally zero useful pharmacological interventions. Obviously, the cross-sectional information really shows that physical activity and Mediterranean diet do seem to reduce what we call the modifiable risk factors of dementia. And I view that argument also very much like the global warming argument. I mean, even if global warming wasn't happening, certainly it's an advantage to reduce pollution, etc., and waste. The same with diet and exercise. I mean, the worst case scenario, which obviously we've shown isn't the case, is that it doesn't have a big effect on the brain, but keeping the body healthier certainly has no disadvantages, as far as I can see. And what also helped is in the 2017, the Lancet Commission, probably the most authoritative review of this sort of thing, really, as did the WHO, prioritise the need to target these known risk factors of dementia. So we have about 60% of the risk of dementias which are perhaps unknown, most likely genetic and environmental. So we're working with the 40%, and the exercise and dietary interventions cover a good chunk of those, especially if you also approach hearing and smoking, which are probably two other big ones in the middle to later age. There are other studies, clinical trials, thankfully, that are starting to work in this area, and that we use them as part of the basis for what we did. The PrettyMed study in Spain, I believe, looks at Mediterranean diet on cognitive functions, but cognition wasn't the outcome, and they didn't include exercise. The FINGER study, which is, many of you may have heard of the worldwide FINGERS studies, which is a lot of studies now that are looking at interventions for dementia. They've certainly found that nutritional guidance, exercise, cognitive training has, and other things have led to a reduction in cognitive decline over 2 years. They are heavily limited by the sort of testing that they use, and they also did not include the Mediterranean diet. Nutritional guidance was really just a way of reducing elements of unhealthy eating rather than potentially introducing better diet and a more complete diet. So the MedWalk study, which is underway at the moment, was looking at a multi-cluster, multi-site cluster randomized controlled trial. Basically, that means we use retirement villages across Melbourne and across Adelaide. So the clusters became, each village would work together as a group this time. The mistake we made last time was randomizing people throughout the study into one of our 4 groups, effectively removing the social and mutual support and the social connectivity that these sort of things get together. So this time we decided that each site would be either an intervention site or it would be a control site. And also we are looking at doing these interventions grounded in established psychosocial behavioural change techniques. Big, long, wordy thing for using motivational techniques that are known to work in the medical field to help people make these changes. Because without the help and the support and maintaining motivation, learning how to get back on the wagon, it will become just like everything else that we've done in life. We've all been on diets and fallen off the wagon. Many of us have joined a gym. I know I certainly have, and then stopped going after a short period of time or an exercise program. So the continued support and the continued motivation is a really important part. It's where a lot of public health campaigns really fall down. The Life Minute campaign is probably a classic example of a lot of money spent telling people to exercise more and eat better. And we, over that time, we doubled our calorific intake, doubled our obesity levels, and more than half our activity levels. So telling people what to do doesn't help. Helping them do it, giving them the resources, giving them things to fall back on and support does work. And a good example of that would probably be the anti-smoking campaigns combined with the cost increases. Again, all the other support services provided. And we were looking at the change, we were intending to look at the change in cognition over 2 years. And we hypothesised that these established and robust measures of cognitive performance will show less decline in those intervention participants than relative to control, which is people maintaining their own habitual lifestyles. We also wanted to look at mood and quality of life, cardiovascular functioning, not surprisingly after the last study that we looked at, and many other relevant biomarkers, because we also want to start finding out more about why these things are doing what they do. So what's happening with the gut bacteria and the metabolites for with the diet. So knowing things work is one thing, working out how and why and how we can monitor their effectiveness, that's really another step that we still need to take in the research. Again, I think we're talking about the MICBT, which is the psychosocial motivational change. But we also want to look at the health and economic impact of this sort of intervention. So again, well, it's difficult to convince governments on the basis of human suffering or health, etc. An economic argument for these sort of programs is a lot better. So we will be using hospital data, etc., to try and look at the overall impact on the health system economically of this sort of intervention. Our primary outcome is will be a more used version of the sort of testing we're doing. Effectively, what we call paired associates learning. So it's again, it's those areas of memory, particularly things we're not familiar with, that seem to be the most easily affected and the fastest to decline. So this is a much more widely used study, and we'll be using that for MedWalk. Initial idea was 28 facilities or sites across Victoria and South Australia with 13 people per site. I'll come to the realities of that in a minute, but that was the idea. And again, based on the findings we had last time, I won't go over that too much. So we're looking at over 350 participants, same sort of age groups across Victoria and South Australia who live in retirement villages. Very few reasons you couldn't be involved in the study, because the idea was to be as inclusive as possible. As long as you can walk, you were not already suffering from mild cognitive impairment or greater, and you were not significantly suffering from depression or depressive symptoms that were cognitively affecting, then you were fine. Obviously, if you had dementia or a history of stroke or head trauma, but even the stroke or head trauma, as long as recovery was complete to whatever it was going to be, we were happy to have you in the study, because again, any change we should see should be to do with the intervention or not. And also people that were already doing a huge amount of exercise and had a completely Mediterranean diet. There was no point being in the study because they were already doing exactly those things anyway. So I won't go on too long because I know I'm running short of time. I think I want to make the point, this time we looked at intensive support. So we were looking at using exercise scientists and dietitians to go to these sites. They would run regular interventions, one-on-one dietetic sessions with people. We would have regular walking groups, weekly walking groups, bi-weekly or to fortnightly diet visits, and then these would taper off across the year. So they would sort of diet visits would be fortnightly for 8 weeks, then monthly for 8 weeks, for 2 months, and then quarterly. And similarly, the exercise groups would taper off over time. But the diet interventions would include things like cooking classes, advice on how to change and deal with dislikes and unfamiliar foods. And the walking would be advice on how to improve your own walking for more health benefits. And of course, trying to get walking groups organised, because it's the mutual support we know is quite important. It's easy to motivate yourself when other people are doing the same thing. And the control groups really were able to do whatever they can continue their habitual lifestyle. They're also free to change their diet if they wished. They just had to, the difference is they wouldn't get the education. I won't go into too much detail, but it's quite comprehensive in what we were doing, and I'm happy to talk about that more with people individually. Now, again, our timeline, I'm not even going to go more than 1 second on that, because around about the start of the timeline, COVID hit. So basically, unfortunately, like a lot of us, COVID had a massive impact on the study, significantly delayed, particularly the Victorian arm of things. So we're hoping now to finish our baseline in September, October 22, which would mean we finish the study in September, October 23. We had a huge impact on the budget, not surprisingly, just with things being delayed for so long. Also in Victoria, particularly, we found a lot of people who were initially willing found that the trauma of COVID, they withdrew. We had a lot of withdrawals from people from initial interest to actually when we finally got to go back to these sites after all the years of lockdown. Also, many of these sites are attached to high care facilities, so we still can't access some of them, because even having a common entryway, it was obviously are very cautious, and they didn't want people coming into facilities unless they were residents. Unfortunately, that's reduced us to about 50% of our original cohort planned. And also the study has had to be reduced from 12 to 24 months, which is not too bad because the second year was just observational for us. We wanted to do the intervention and then see, and we're still hoping to get funding to follow up 12 months or more after the end of the study. So what's next? Obviously, we want to complete the MedWalk trial, but I guess the notes I want to leave people on is that we need to continue prevention research. We particularly need more clinical trials to provide that top level evidence. Whether it's in the exercise and diet or other areas of prevention, hearing, other things, it's really important that we get more of this evidence, and especially with the financial oversight or economic modelling to show the benefits, not just to the brain, but that we move on. We need to move on eventually to implementation of these sort of things. It's great to research it, but the next thing is how do we then use it? It's good to have good results. We've got good results. I don't know what's going to happen with MedWalk, of course, it's not finished. But we have been working as a team. Recently, we just missed out on a Medical Research Future Fund for a 5-year implementation grant, which we closely worked on with who's also at NARI, who has that expertise in implementation. So really, that's the next step, is to take what we've got so far, and where a lot of us and our research groups as well tend to fall up is that we don't take the next step into program development, and that's maybe where groups like NARI, etc., are probably very well placed to take that next. Again, hence why we're working with NARI for the implementation grants. I'll leave this up here in case people want the slides, but this is probably one of the just before I finish my last slide. This is a fantastic diagram. Many of you have probably seen it. It's from the Lancet Commission's review of dementia prevention, dementia risk, and really looking at where the major risk factors are that we know about. About 60% of the risk for dementia is still unknown. We think about 40% of the risk for dementia is modifiable. And again, we're working in these areas of the diabetes, physical inactivity, social isolation, obesity, hypertension. That all sort of works with the exercise and diet, alcohol, etc. I will stop it there because I know I've gone quite long, and Tanya will get grumpy with me in a minute. So I'll just thank everybody for their time, and if I have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Greg. We now have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the chat function. Alternatively, if you would like to ask your question in person, please turn on your camera and microphone and we'll call on you in turn. I'm just looking at the chat. Oh, sorry. We have a question from Stephen.
Yes.
And lots of well done, Greg. So can you see that, Greg?
Not at the moment. So I'm just having a bit
okay, I'll read it to you.
So if you wouldn't mind just
I'll read it to you. Yeah. Okay, so Steph asks, what were the biggest changes people made to their diets as a result of this study research?
Olive oil, straight up, because we gave it to them. That's the one thing we look forward to. So that was generally we found the biggest change was. Apart from that, it was varied in terms of interest. Probably the other one was a reduction in red meat. We didn't get to an improvement in fish eating, I don't recall, to the same degree, but the people did find it, at least that challenge was the easiest one to meet, which was reducing that red meat. But olive oil was the biggest, easiest change. Wasn't easy in a way, except for the fact because people, we're a generation that were told that oil was going to kill us, basically, fats were going to kill us. I know myself, I probably used a can of spray oil at about 3 years at one stage because I was too scared about the fats. And after the research and And some people really got into using the olive oil and got used to the taste of it. So we couldn't keep up with the NAM to a degree.
And there was a comment that I think it was in response to where you had your slide about the pharmacological treatments haven't been as effective as diet. And so Janice says it's very good news, an apple a day. I have a question. Maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more, Greg, on the motivational interviewing behavioural therapy approach, and if you've got any sort of key messages that you could share with us.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for giving me the soapbox of this one. That's a lovely soapbox. I love it. Thank you. It's because I'm really excited about this, because we all know that exercise, diet, those sort of changes. But I would challenge to say that there's a single person who hasn't tried a diet at some stage of some sort and failed at it, regardless of what it was or what the reason was. And the same for exercise programs. I mean, my getting up at 6 in the morning to go for a walk very rapidly ran away once it got cold again. So what this is really about, this is world-leading research, and when I say research, it's also been implemented in medical fields across England and a lot of Europe by Professor Brecken. It looks at using people's own motivation, basically, to find out why do you want to do what you want to do. So stop actually us saying, thinking we know what we're talking about. We know why you want to do something, and listening. I'm going to say, for me, difficult challenges. Tanya was probably smiling right there. The hardest thing I ever found was the really stopping and listening to people we were working with properly, rather than being the expert. That's a real challenge for a lot of us that have spent decades being the expert. But we're the expert in our topic here. We're not the expert in the people we're talking to. They're the expert in them. They know what motivates themselves. I think the classic example for me was talking to one lady once at a stage about the potential physical advantages of the exercise and diet change. And I said something about, like, when you'll be out there really keep up with the grandkids, and she just looked around and said, I bloody hate kids. She goes, I love my grandkids. I'm happy to give them cake and cake and milk and send them outside. But the last thing I want to do is to keep up with them. Again, my assumption of her motivations was not her motivations. And if I tried to use my assumptions, I would never be able to help her succeed. The other part, sorry, just before I finish up on that, Tanya, is that it's also about making changes that you can make, bolus changes, jumping from worst case scenario, eating McDonald's 7 days a week to a pure Mediterranean diet is 100% bound to fail. Making the changes, working through one change, I said one change is better than none. Changing to eating more legumes for a start, maybe. Cutting the alcohol down, even if you don't get down to the level which you want to start with. Reducing one red meat meal a week. Those sort of changes are doable. You get used to them, you get support, you can do the next one. But you'll fall off the wagon. And if you feel guilty about falling off the wagon, if you feel that that's it, I can't do it anymore, then you'll stop. So the falling off the wagon is also another part. How do you understand that? Deal with it, work out the reasons you've fallen off the wagon, and how you could, what you can do, what will help you get back on the wagon.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the study I found as well. We've got one more question from Anita. And she says, thanks, Greg. I might have missed this, but how do you collect info on social connections?
You should actually do it through questionnaires, if I'm honest. So at this sort of stage, because we're still quantitative analysis, we didn't have the resources to do qualitative analysis, but we do questions about what people do, who their connections are, their connections with family, friends, relatives, neighbours, etc. So there is actually social networking scores. In fact, it's something that we use in the MedWalk, project. But I'll also point out just quickly, if I can tangent from that the social stuff can be so important. One of the strongest exercise papers, which was done in Japan, where older people are usually looked after or live with their younger relatives, found quite a big change in cognition and mood. But it was only subsequent research in that particular study that found out that there was almost no change in fitness. It was all social. Because they were so socially isolated, these groups became such a motivating and changing factor for them that almost universally, apart from a couple, they had improvements in cognition just because of social connection. So that's important. And again, why we chose the cluster process this time around for doing the MedWalk trial, because of that importance of the social interaction. And even if there's some of these villages, we're doing these clusters now, we're finding that people who live 30 feet from each other haven't met before. And people who come in recently, it's like being a new person in high school. There's nothing more like a high school, honestly, than a retirement village. So again, this social connectivity has already shown, at least observationally, to be really useful.
That's great. Okay, if there are any other questions for Greg? Okay, doesn't look like there's any more in the chat. So if there's no other questions, please join me in thanking Greg with your clap reactions. And thank you for attending our Seminars in Aging program. And you'll be advised of the upcoming programs, no doubt, by the team shortly.